So they play the West a little bit to get some money from one side, they play the Russians on the other side. You know, we will crush Donetsk, but actually, I think they will make a deal with Donetsk.
The thing is that the events have more sort of taken over from the as you say, the plan of the Americans and the Russians as well. The Americans have set up this trouble in Ukraine in order to get influence. And the fascists have tagged on to that. And in the East, the people in the East, I believe, genuinely are worried about the fascists in Kiev.
But what fascists?
Because they're
2% of the vote.
Yeah, but they've got the Ministry of Defence, the
Well,
Ministry
for how
of
much
Interior.
longer?
They were the ones that took over the power in the first place.
Yeah.
They were the ones that did most of the shooting in Kiev.
But I mean, is the implication, what is a fascist takeover? A fascist takeover means that once a country has a fascist regime established, all democratic rights are eliminated, people are unable to speak freely, people get put in incarceration, in concentration camps, and politics is abolished, and instead of that a dictatorship is established. That's not what's happening in Ukraine, right? So there were fascist forces involved in the seizure of power at the time when Yanukovych's government fell. Yanukovych's government was democratically elected but was a corrupt, billionaires, thieving oligarch. Now, inside the eastern area, there are also 3 or 4 oligarchs who dominate the affairs of the region. They also manipulate people and mobilize people with their big money. And they have alliances with Russia and with the economic interests of Russia. They're more tied to the Russian economy. And so that's one side of the pressure in play in the east of Ukraine. And in the west of Ukraine, the pressure is linked with oligarchs, of pro-Western oligarchs. Yeah. But the peculiarity is that in the west of Ukraine, living standards are lower than the east of Ukraine. So as a consequence of that, the material base of support in the east is quite strong. But at the same time, the idea that a fascist movement is in power in Ukraine, I think, is completely wrong. And there are lots of leftists who are saying that's the case. I think they're completely mistaken. And they ended up basically as apologists for what Putin is arguing. And Putin is basically the Russians in third period Stalinism, 1928, they said anyone who doesn't agree with us is a fascist.
Right. But surely that you would agree that the Western powers, and particularly the European Fund Market and the IMF, are trying to get hold of Ukraine in order to privatise it and
trying to get hold of it, whether elections.
Well, you can get hold of it by various means. One means can be election, another means can be international economic agreements, a third means could be. Well, I would tend to agree.
They're basically an imperialist country, and they've always been imperialist, particularly under Stalin and under Putin.
I would disagree with you on that, but I do agree with you that there aren't really powerful economic interests of the Americans in getting involved in Ukraine. Second point is the illustration which shows the argument that America has some grand, successful plan that's taking place at the moment is what's happening in Iraq. There we have 11 years of war, organised and orchestrated by the Americans, completely collapsing. Everything the Americans worked for, they spent $2 million US on the war in Iraq. Everything they worked for is falling apart. Not only that, but the people they wanted to fight last year, because they're the main enemy, in other words, Syria, or before that, Iran. Now Iran is supposedly the ally of America. It's like George Orwell, you know. One moment fight Eurasia, next moment East Asia. You know, we don't even know who we're fighting anymore. Except all of a sudden, a break-off of Al-Qaeda, in other words, a more insane grouping than Bin Laden's grouping, is sweeping the board in Iraq, where the Americans established a solid and stable democracy which they could leave behind to the Iraqis to rule themselves. That's the result. That idiot, Tony Blair, comes on the radio and says, well, it's nothing to do with me. You should have gone to Syria as well. You know, that's the type of idiocy that we are being told is the grand plans for the world. Where's the grand plan? Al-Qaeda take Baghdad, grand plan? I don't think so. So the Americans basically are stumbling alongside the British from one disaster to another. One disaster. And actually what's happened in Ukraine has been the stuffing of the Americans by the Russians. They run rings around them. Rings around them. When the Americans want to do something, what Donetsk declares independent, Crimea declares independent, they run rings around the Americans. The Americans don't know what they're doing. And as for the European Union, stepping in to take over, or Germany stepping in to take over Ukraine, well, they can't even control. They can't control Spain. They can't control Greece. They can't control Italy. They can't control Portugal. And now all of a sudden we're told Germany's going to take over Ukraine and march into Moscow. I don't think so.
Hold it for a second. Where did we hear that? Tony Blair this morning was a disgrace. I mean, to announce he'd been right all the time and sending for more troops was, as you say, totally ludicrous. In fact, there have been cock-ups all round.
Well, that's right.
There's been one disaster after another. The Americans make disasters, the Russians will make disasters. It's nothing to do with politics, it's everything to do with realpolitik. I think there's no chance whatever that Obama will send in foreign troops. He said he won't. Thank God he won't.
Well,
I think the Americans have, to your point, have actually learnt from that disaster.
The Iranians are effectively, their political leadership in Iraq is allied to the Iranians. So that's already a disaster from the point of view of the United States. Now the Americans are trying to, or the Iranians are basically offering a fig leaf to the Americans in order to get involved in trying to stop this ISIS grouping from taking over in Iraq. Well, you know, you sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. Well, that's what they've done. And it was predictable. It was predictable that the Americans and this insane policy by Tony Blair would result in disaster, and now we have it. Thank you very much. Now we have it.
It's very difficult to disagree. You're absolutely right.
This is their own creation, you know. And I think this idea that the Ukraine is an example of the power of America, I think what we're seeing is that the limits of American power, like many empires in history, they reach a certain limit and they begin to collapse. And then every single thing they do begins to be a disaster. Almost everything they do will turn to dust. And that's really what we're seeing. And the Europeans not much different. The Europeans on the one side might turn around and say, we want to deal with Ukraine. On the other side, Scotland might break away, or better said, England might break away, or France might break away, or Spain might break away, or Italy might break away, Greece might break away. So where's the internal cohesion necessary to maintain stability, growth, and increase your capacity to integrate new countries into your field of economic, political, and military operation? I think what we're seeing is the opposite process. The process of disintegration and entropy and chaos breaking out, linked in with the policies they pursued, which is the same thing. In Syria, they talked about bombing Syria. Well, they backed off of that, quite correctly backed off of that. But of course, what was their aim? Overthrow Assad. Overthrow Assad for what? For what's happening in Libya. Libya, the same type of scenario. Mad Al-Qaeda gangs are trying to develop their position of authority in Libya as well. So I don't think the American position is particularly strong in the world at all. You know, doesn't mean they can't do stuff. They do stuff. You know, they're listening to your mobile phone conversation. Perhaps they're spending too much time to listen to our mobile phone conversations. Not enough time to listen to Al-Qaeda's phone conversations. You know, it's probably easier to listen to us, record what we do on the internet, than it is what they do, because they probably spend less time on the internet, more time going, you know, let's kill the Americans. You know, and after all this poison, so many hundreds of thousands or millions even dead, is it any wonder that people in this country... I remember a friend of mine from Pakistan, he told me, you know, he met some refugees from Afghanistan. They came into the country, stayed there for several years, and they just said, look, turned around to my friend, they said, I don't know how to describe it, they said, but I'm not normal. And he said, what do you mean you're not normal? You're like anybody else? He says, no, I've seen so much killing and death. I'm not normal anymore. Nothing shocks me like that. So for these people, you see why there's such enthusiasm behind these fighters now in Iraq? Because they've just had it up to here. Years and years and years of slaughter. Well, now they're prepared to die themselves, you know. They don't care. So consequence of that is, you know, this has really been a poison sown by the Americans and the British. Like most of the poison historically. The problem is now, the Americans and the British don't have the capacity to mop it up, the poison they've created. So one disaster after another is likely to befall many countries in the world actually, and particularly those countries where the Americans have intervened heavily, and suddenly they're unable to. And of course, as soon as people see that the Americans are no longer a guaranteed bargain for support, then of course they'll shift alliances. Look at the Pakistanis. The Pakistanis tied in with the Americans and with the Saudi Arabians. Now, well, they're looking, they've always had an eye on China, now they're looking at China much more than to America, because they can't guarantee anything from the Americans. Will guarantee a drone fly overhead and drop a bomb. That's what they're talking about on television. Oh, well, we can send in drones and they can fire bombs automatically. Yeah, well, you're not going to resolve the problem on the ground in Iraq by dropping drones on people. You know, how do you distinguish one from the other? So they don't have enough native language speakers to be able to detect what all the communications are about.
Do you think they want to mop up the thing, or they want a chaos to carry on, which is just very interesting?
Well, I don't think they want chaos to carry on. I think there are some occasions historically where chaos is beneficial to a ruling country, but you know, and you can give examples. For example, Britain. It's useful for London, for example, to have chaos in the Middle East, because then the wealthiest people from London move to Edgware Road and come to Speaker's Corner. Now, that's useful because they have like 7 billion in their pocket, you know. And you know, they just last week they made a report that prostitution is part of the British economy. Well, they add a significant proportion to the prostitution market, I'm pretty sure.
People from the Middle East move to London.
Yes, people from the Middle East.
You said from London to Edgware Road.
Oh, well, they move from the Middle East to London and then hang out on the Edgware Road. I mean, that's, you know, sit there smoking shishas and driving Ferraris up and down.
And prostitution also.
Sorry?
And prostitution.
Well, that's what I said. But you see, once you have this, the billionaires coming to London, it does pump up the economy a little bit. There's no doubt about it. For example, property prices in London, they're definitely helped by an influx of billionaires from the Middle East. There's no doubt about that. And of course, that keeps David Cameron happy. So there are some benefits. On the other side, from the overall strategic end, for example, of getting England to beat Italy, no benefit whatsoever. For that, you need morale within society. And the morale, obviously, is very weak in Britain. I mean, did you see Greece play? You know, why do you think they were so crap? The country's collapsing. They don't even know who to play. Is that on my team? I don't know. Should I pass? I don't know. Maybe I've got to keep it for myself. Maybe I'm not going to get a ball again. You know what I mean? It was like that. So they're completely incompetent as a consequence of the general collapse in society. You know, and that I think is reflected in this type of way. You know, the British and the Americans are in a very deep social and economic crisis. It's just continuing one year after another year after another year, and that reflects itself in its military incompetence and its strategic incompetence on a world scale. Are there any questions or contributions?
Why did the Chinese official refuse to come to Britain unless he met the Queen?
I don't know. I never heard that. Who was that?
There's one Chinese official that says he's not going to come unless he gets.
Well, I would guess that's because protocol would determine that a leader, if it is a leader, I don't know who it was, sorry, that a leader should meet the head of state. So I guess if they're not meeting a head of state, then they're being treated, they might consider they're being treated badly. I don't know. I'm not responsible for every activity the Chinese government does or doesn't do. Most of them, yes, but not all of them. Not all of them. I'm working on the rest of them, you know. I'll have a word with the Politburo in a few days' time.
There's a lot of potential though for Russia and China to become closer in a more of a bloc and to counteract what they consider to be the dangerous.
Well, I mean, you say there's a lot of potential. There is potential, it's not all that much. In the 1960s, had the Russians and Chinese made an alliance, would have been a different thing. But at that time, they were battling each other or arguing with each other. Now, what do the Russians actually have? A lot of old infrastructure, oil and gas, that's it. So they've made a deal about the oil and gas. The Chinese have got basically oil and gas for a few decades into the future, which they can plan for. They've actually got the money to pay for it all in advance. So, I mean, imagine, you know, you live in a flat in London and you pay 15 years electricity and gas in advance. Well, it gives you a certain security, doesn't it? Yeah. So that's what the Chinese have done. They basically bought oil and gas into the future. Just the same as they're doing in other parts of the world, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia. They're making deals to get resources for the long term. While they're making hay while the sun shines, basically, what the British Empire used to do 150 years ago in terms of gaining a foothold and influence for the long term that the Chinese state is doing on a world scale at the moment. So they're establishing which were almost unheard of. I mean, 10 years ago, in fact even 5 years ago, I read an American military report about China, and they were saying, well, the Chinese are doing diplomacy in Africa. They gave someone a panda bear, right? Now this is not what they're doing. They're building, thousands of miles of high-speed railway. Every city of over 500,000 in Africa now is going to have a high-speed railway connecting it by the Chinese. Every city in Africa. Now, in Europe we don't have that. So that would create leap forward in African infrastructure, which would lay the foundation in theory for economic development. Depends on the social system, of course, but
so
nevertheless.
As an African, I have to be happy with that. Eh?
Happy what?
So as an African, I have to be happy with that.
I didn't say happy with that, I'm just describing what's happening.
In 1957,
whether you're happy is another question.
In 1957, the same policy the Chinese are doing, the Kwame Nkrumah were doing the same policy. Kwame Nkrumah was the first president of Ghana.
Yeah.
And he made the policy, and he come to Addis Ababa. Addis Ababa is the central of the whole of African people, whole of the black people. The black capital is Addis Ababa. And you know, in 1963, what he said? The same thing. We can build our own railway. We can build our own things.
Yeah,
you know what happened?
He was wrong. They killed him. But he was wrong. He was wrong because they didn't have the capital to invest. Nor did the Chinese at that. I mean, they did the Trans Am Railway and Trans Am Dam and so on.
I'm asking you a question. I'm a generation who study my African roots, my African knowledge. I have every African knowledge.
Will the Africans benefit from this?
Sorry, go on.
Brother, sorry about that. I apologize. I am knowledgeable on the question of African people for what happened from the slavery, 400 years of slavery, but nobody apologized.
Sorry.
Nobody says sorry to the African slavery.
Sorry.
No one.
The issue is slightly different than I'm talking
But
about.
I'm sorry, he make me that. But let me tell, I'm sorry, I'm against
You can come back in, but let me...
But what Kwame Nkrumah said is the same thing that you're saying. So I'm asking you the question, brother. Do you think, even I'm happy what you're saying is true, the Chinese did something good that what the English or the colonial power didn't do it. They didn't build us the railway. The Chinese did. But no, in Kenya and Rwanda and Tanzania, there is a railway going to China. The Chinese gonna build. But you know what the British and American did to the Kenya?
They give them a Bible.
No. Right now, what they're doing is sabotaging the tourism.
Yeah.
They sabotage him, and they are not happy with the deal with this.
Well, there's two components, isn't it? One is to have an infrastructure. An infrastructure is a state-state deal. The difference with Western imperialism was the Western imperialists would make a deal with Mobutu. Mobutu export the copper, and when he's paid $7 billion for the copper, he transfers the copper to Europe, and then he sends the money to Europe as well, so nothing remains in Africa. The distinction with the Chinese deals is when the Chinese build infrastructure, it's there physically on the ground. So it's there as a resource able to be used by the people.
But why do you are so against
what type of government the people have in those countries is tied by the same internal social conflicts as existed at the time of Nkrumah and others who were fighting for the liberation of Africa after 1945. And that struggle is basically the internal social struggle against their own ruling class inside Africa, inside different African countries, and for the unity of Africa on the basis of unifying the economy and the continent of Africa by democratic planning and public ownership.
But
that, I believe, is the only way you can get around that.
Against the democracy.
What's
you know what? Every president of Africa in 1960, most of the African country get their independence in 1960. For example, I'll take you an example. In Congo, when they get the independence in 1961, Patrick Lumumba, what he said is the richest, the land of Congo, not even belong to Congolese. Yes, they belong to the Congolese, but they also belong to the African who are poor.
Well,
and in that world, The European, they say, the British, everybody, they say, he's a communist. He wasn't.
No. Well, I mean, in many respects,